The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar. Today we're continuing what's been a monthly webinar series that's supported by the Federal Highway Administration's Everyday Counts Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian initiative, or STEP. We are today going to be focusing on the pedestrian hybrid beacon, which is one of the countermeasures that's included in the STEP guidance for improving pedestrian safety at uncontrolled crossing locations. We're going to be talking all about the specifics of the PHB, the Pedestrian Hybrid Beacon, and we'll be hearing from some agencies that have had success in using these treatments. So we're glad you were able to join us today to continue this series. My name is Dan Jeline. I will be facilitating the webinar today, and I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to the panelists that we've assembled for today's presentations. Dwayne Thomas is a member of the Federal Highway Administration's Resource Center Operations Technical Service Team, and also serves as a member of FHWA's Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, or MUTCD, team, with responsibility for the highway traffic signals and traffic control areas for railroad and light rail transit grade crossings. Dwayne previously worked with the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet and the FHWA Kentucky Division Office. We also have Joel Meyer joining us today. Joel is the pedestrian coordinator for the Austin Transportation Department in Austin, Texas. He was lead author on Austin's recently completed Pedestrian Safety Action Plan, which lays out 21 action items to improve safety and eliminate pedestrian fatalities in Austin. Ryan Lowe is also joining us. He's an engineer at the City of Columbus in Columbus, Ohio, in the Department of Public Service Division of Traffic Management. His responsibilities include management of traffic studies, development studies, intelligent transportation systems, traffic control, and signal operations sections. So we're really grateful to have all of these panelists here today to share their expertise on what's a really important topic, a really important countermeasure system that's still relatively new, I'd say, in the whole toolbox of countermeasures that we have at our disposal. So we'll get into some of that. I have a few housekeeping items to breeze through just briefly here. I'd encourage you, if you have any issues with your audio or connection with the webinar today, to please just close out of the webinar and log back in. You should be able to correct those problems just by doing that. If you have questions along the way or comments, please send those to us using the questions pod in the GoToWebinar window. You won't have the ability to speak up. We do expect a pretty large crowd today, but we do have time built in at the end to respond to your questions. If you submit those along the way, we've got about 30 minutes at the very end that I'm going to be able to pose those questions to our panelists. We are archiving the webinar, as we always do. I've already posted the PDF copy of the presentation slides on our website. If you visit pedbikeinfo.org/webinars, you can navigate to this webinar's page, and you'll find the PDF copy link at the bottom of that page. I'll shortly be sending it out to the group using the chat pod once we get into the presentations. We're also recording the webinar today, so we'll be posting the video. If you know someone who couldn't attend and wants to review the material, they'll be able to do that on that same page. Later today, you're going to get an email that has all this information in it, the link to the registration or the archive page, the recording. It'll have a copy of the presentations as well as links to some more resources and a page where you can generate a certificate of attendance. If you are attending the webinar with multiple people in your group, please make sure you circulate that email that's going to come to you later today. It'll have that link that everyone can use to generate a certificate of attendance for the webinar. We've also had the webinar posted and approved by the AICP for CM credits for planners. So if you claim those, please navigate over to their website and log the credits there. Webinars and news, you can find more information on a lot of our upcoming sessions at pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. I mentioned these STEP webinars are happening on about a monthly basis. So if you're not on our mailing list, you can do that, pedbikeinfo.org/sign up. That's where we send messages out when we do schedule these webinars and other PBIC webinars. We're also on social media if that's a place you want to find us there. So I'd encourage you to do all that. I want to spend a moment and just talk a little bit about the STEP program. Many of you probably joined us for our January webinar giving an overview of a lot of the STEP guidance. And really, STEP is intended to lay out a lot of important guidance for agencies to figure out how best to improve pedestrian safety at uncontrolled crossing locations. And there are these 5 countermeasures you see on your screen that are really included in a lot of that guidance. And a new one coming soon, the rectangular rapid flashing beacon, is making its way into the guidance. So we'll be updating you in the future on that. But when we did a poll in our first webinar of which of these countermeasures is least familiar to you, the pedestrian hybrid beacon came in first place with about 42% of the people on that webinar said that it was the least familiar to them among these choices. So we knew wanted to get into more detail, and that's one of the reasons for this webinar today, is to talk a little bit more about the PHB and how it can be used. But you'll find STEP guidance online. I'll share the link in a moment. The guidance, in addition to providing a lot of information about the webinar, lays out this six-step process for how you can go about understanding the needs and safety considerations at various crossing locations, how you can analyze information, crash data to look at safety issues, and then finally select countermeasures and install those and make some decisions about where best to install different treatments. The field guide for selecting countermeasures at crossing locations helps support a lot of the guidance that you'll find online. It's a really great way to provide some step-by-step guidance that fills in some of the gaps that were in that 2005 study. Many of you know it as the Zagier study, looking at when and where to mark and not mark crosswalks. Well, the step guidance really takes that to the next level and says, in order to mark these crosswalks and really protect pedestrians at these locations, these are the other treatments that you need to consider beyond just paint on the ground when you mark these locations, depending on traffic speed, traffic volume, number of lanes, and these sorts of factors. There's a lot more information you can find online. And again, we've done some webinars previously that covered a lot of the detail of the STEP program. I'd encourage you to reach out to Becky or Peter. You see their information here if you have some questions about STEP, or visit that web link, and I'll send that out in just a moment to get all the information. But what we're really going to be doing today is diving into the PHB, the Pedestrian Hybrid Beacon, and we're lucky to have our panelists here to help us do that. Before we get into the presentation, the last thing I'd like to do is ask a quick poll of you all to weigh in on how many people are out there today. Some of you, it may be just you joining from your site. Others may be joined by a small group. If you could take just a moment and cast your vote in this poll, we'd really appreciate it. It'll help us understand how many people are out there. Once I leave this open for maybe another 5 or 10 seconds, I will move right into our presentations. Okay, thank you all very much. I'm going to go ahead and close that poll now. I appreciate your feedback. Without any more delay, I'm going to turn things over to our first panelist, Dwayne Thomas, to start things up. So Dwayne, keep an eye on your screen. You should be able to take control and show us your slides and get started.
Great. How's that?
That looks great. Go right ahead, Dwayne.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm glad to be here today. As he said, I'm a newest member to the FHWA MUTCD team. I started in this position in January, and then many of you probably know Bruce Friedman. He retired at the end of March, and so I took over the areas of the MUTCD that he was previously responsible for, which of course is highway signals and railroad grade crossing. So again, I'm glad to be here today. We'll jump right in. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the current version of the MUTCD. It's the 2009 with the revisions 1 and 2. A lot of people ask the status of the MUTCD, when's the new one coming out? Unfortunately, we still don't have a time frame for that. We would love to get to work and get a new version out, but for now, there's still no timeline, but we are hopeful and ready to get started as soon as we get the go-ahead to do that. But this is the current version, and pedestrian hybrid beacons, of course, were added to this version when it came out in 2009. I just wanted to do my little commercial here for the MUTCD website. This is something that many people are really familiar with, but others may not know as much about all the detail that's on our website. So I like to put this slide in every presentation that I do. And I want to call your attention, this is just the opening page to the website, but the red box that I've added up in the left-hand corner, many of you have probably clicked on this and subscribed, but we have actually a e-subscribe service that if you subscribe to that and enter your email address, we send out pretty regular emails with information on what's going on. Anytime something new is issued, an official ruling or interim approvals, we send out emails. We try not to overload your inbox with with information, but this is a good way to stay connected. If you're not familiar with it, I'd highly recommend you go to our website and subscribe to that. We dive right in here to talk about pedestrian treatments. As we said today, we're going to be talking about pedestrian hybrid beacons, but of course, there's a whole list in our toolbox of treatments for pedestrian safety. And as you can see there, the second one on the list, enhanced conspicuity of pedestrian crossing signs, that's the RRFB, falls into that category. And of course, that's been a very active issue of late. It was on again, off again, and now back on again with interim approval 21. And we have had a tremendous outpouring of requests for interim approval under that. And I spent a lot of time working on that, but hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about those at a later date. Today, we're again talking about pedestrian hybrid beacons. Here's a picture in case you don't know what they look like. This is a location in Phoenix, and that's what it looks like. Pedestrian hybrid beacons started in the late 90s in the city of Tucson, Arizona, and they were modeled after a similar device that was seen in England. And of course, as many of you know, it was originally called the Hawk. I had heard of that term many times, but didn't realize what the acronym stood for. But there it is. It's the High Intensity Activated Crosswalk Beacon. I think I kind of like the name Pedestrian Hybrid Beacon. It's a little easier, but a lot of people refer to these as Hawks and use the terms somewhat interchangeably. This is what the operation looks like. Just walk you through the chart here. It starts out in dark mode. That's one of the unique features of the pedestrian hybrid beacon, is that it's dark until it's activated by a pedestrian. Once it's activated, it goes to a flashing yellow sequence to alert traffic that the signal's about to do something. Then it goes to a steady yellow clearance interval for traffic, and then that is followed by a steady red indication. And at the same time the steady red comes on, the walk signals, the pedestrian walk interval begins for the pedestrians. Once the walk interval times out, it goes to a flashing red for the pedestrian hybrid beacon, while the pedestrian clearance interval is timing out for the pedestrian signal. And then once that times out, it goes dark again until it's activated again. So like I said, it's kind of a unique operation. It's very effective, but that's the operation. And I'm sure our next panelists are going to speak about their experience and get into some more of the specifics of how theirs work and issues they've had, pros and cons. So this is some of the benefits that were identified in some of the early research that was done in 2010 and in 2016. The pedestrian hybrid beacons were shown to reduce pedestrian crashes by as much as 69% and total crashes by 29%. Serious injury and fatal crashes reduced by 15%. And one of the benefits was rear-end crashes really didn't increase. That's one of the concerns when you install a signal, that a lot of times you increase rear-end crashes, but that was not the case, at least in the initial research. And this generates 50% less delay for traffic compared to traditional signalized crossing, which again is a big benefit. And the driver compliance rate from the research was about 96%, and it possibly even a little better than 96% when you look at kind of how they counted that. But that's a pretty good compliance rate. With the RRFBs, you're down around the 80% compliance usually, or less, depending on where it's installed. So this device, which with the red indications and stopping traffic, is very good compliance for motorists. The application of pedestrian hybrid beacons in the MUTCD, it's an option. It means you don't have to use them, but if you want to use these, then you have to follow the guidelines in the MUTCD. But it says a pedestrian hybrid beacon may be considered for installation to facilitate pedestrian crossings. If a traffic control signal is warranted, the decision's made not to install the signal, then this is an option kind of a step down from a full-blown signal. Or if a traffic control signal is not justified under the signal warrants, but you still have issues with gaps in traffic and approach speeds and pedestrian delays, then it sends you to this two charts in the MUTCD. Figure 4F1 is the guidelines for PHVs on low-speed roadways. That's 35 miles an hour or less. And basically, you just plot a point of the major street total of both approaches in vehicles per hour and the total pedestrian crossings per hour. And if that falls above the line for the length of your crosswalk, then that's a good indication that you should consider a PHB. And of course, the four different lines on there, L is the length of the crossing. So that's how you use that chart. And again, that was for low speed highways. For high speed, it's figure 4F2, and it's the same concept. The lines again there for the crosswalk length. And so that's basically how you determine if you ought to further consider a PHB installation. Now, once the decision's been made to install a PHB, there are some design criteria. And of course, the device is optional, but if once you decide to put one in, then you get into some shall conditions that these are requirements. If you're going to use a PHB, at least two of the pedestrian hybrid beacon faces shall be installed for each approach of the major street. Of course, you have your stop lines. The pedestrian signal heads need to conform to the rest of Chapter 4E, where it just talks about signal heads for pedestrian. And then the pedestrian hybrid beacon is pedestrian actuated. Then we further get into some should conditions. And this one is probably one that's open to a lot of discussion, and I'll be curious when our next panelists speak to hear what their experience has been. But initially, when this came out in the current MUTCD, and it's actually still that way, there's a guidance statement that says that pedestrian hybrid beacons should be installed at least 100 feet from side streets or driveways that are controlled by stop or yield signs. There was quite a bit of discussion about this when the MUTCD came out, and there was been additional research done since the MUTCD, the current version, that indicated that actually it's not an issue or as much of an issue to install these at intersections that are controlled by stop or yield signs. By eliminating that in the current language in the MUTCD, it severely limited the locations where you could consider PHVs, especially if you had highly developed arterials or collectors that had a lot of entrances and driveways. Then it really made it challenging to find a spot to put the pedestrian hybrid beacon that was away from a street or driveway. We have looked at this, and it's when we do issue a new MUTCD, this is something that will very likely be considered for revision. And I know some agencies do install them despite the 100-foot requirement that's currently in the MUTCD, based on engineering judgment that shows that those work okay. So that while it is in the MUTCD that it's a should condition, so with an engineering good documented engineering study, then you could consider not following that should condition. So again, we'll talk about that more with our next panelist and take questions on that later. Again, with the design of PHBs, you want to make the pedestrians as visible as possible, restricting parking and other site obstructions near the crosswalk 100 feet in advance and 20 feet downstream. The installation, of course, you're going to have signs, standard signs and pavement markings for the marked crosswalk. And then this is another issue. If it's installed within a signal system, the current MUTCD says that it should be coordinated within the signal system. But I think some of the research and some of the experiences that practitioners have seen across the country is that, of course, there's better compliance if it goes quickly to the flashing yellow to accommodate the pedestrian. And depending on the situation, that may be acceptable within the signal system. So again, that's a should condition, which means that you should follow that guidance, but if you, based on engineering judgment or study, can document a better way to do it, then that leaves the door open for that situation. The timing of the pedestrian hydrant beacon, the duration of the flashing yellow interval should be determined by engineering judgment. The duration of the steady yellow should be determined using engineering practices, but it's typically the 3 to 6 second steady yellow clearance interval, similar to what you would see at most traffic signals. The regulatory signs is another issue that came up after this was issued. The sign on the left is what's in the current MUTCD that goes with the pedestrian hydrant beacon, which basically just says crosswalk and stop on red. One of the issues with this device that was observed as people use more of these was traffic wasn't sure what to do when it started flashing red. If there's no pedestrian in the crosswalk, then they can proceed, but that's not something a lot of drivers figured out. And so the sign on the right was actually developed and allowed to be used to try to clarify that message. But this still isn't perfect. This is something that I know the National Committee has discussed at their last meeting. It's something we consider. So when this comes around for the next version of the MUTCD, we'll probably still be looking for comments and feedback to try to improve a sign for pedestrian hydrant beacons. But for now, these are the two options that are out there. Another thing you can do with pedestrian hydrant beacons, if you have a wide crossing and a wide enough 6 foot wide or more median that can be used as refuge, you can do a 2-stage crossing, as you can see in the pictures here. The one on the left, they actually offset the crosswalks to try to send a better message to pedestrians that they have to push the button again and do a 2-stage crossing. And the one on the right, same situation, and that angle of the picture is not quite as clear, but that's another 2-stage crossing. Last thing I want to talk about, I talked earlier about the MUTCD website and all the information that's available there. Some of you may be aware of, but not everybody, is that between versions of the MUTCD team is still pretty active in getting new information out. And we do that through official rulings, unofficial rulings, either by email or by phone, but also we issue official rulings that get added to the website. And we also do interim approvals for new advices and make interpretations of the MUTCD. All of these are available on the website on the left-hand side. If you scroll down and on the web page, you'll see on that left column some of those. But what I wanted to mention here is, in case you aren't aware, there's actually an MUTCD hot link PDF file that you can download, which is basically just a PDF of the entire MUTCD. But the benefit of downloading this version is it is kind of a live document. If you notice on the right side of the screen, this is the pedestrian hybrid beacon page. And as you can see, there's on the left, there were some known errors in that figure. Pretty kind of minor, but again, that's in there if you're not aware of it. And then there's been 3 official interpretations on pedestrian hydrant beacons since the MUTCD. So if you're starting out with these, or if you have some of these and aren't aware that there's been additional guidance issued, it would be good to download this hot link version. And if you see a footnote or a note on the left side of the page, and then if you hover over the box and click on it, it'll take you straight to that interpretation on the website and give you more information. And again, some of these are pretty nuanced or minor type things to do with timing, but certainly worth looking at. And our next speakers may get into some of these a little bit, I'm not sure. But again, the hot links version is definitely worth downloading and probably using that as your main source for the current MUTCD. So with that, there's my contact information, and I think we're going to be taking questions a little bit later on, but that's my presentation, and I'll turn it back over. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Dwayne. And before we move on, a couple of questions that I'm sure will be no surprise to you, that you probably hear a lot. I want to go ahead and get them out of the way. This question keeps coming up and has come up before about whether the information and sort of the thresholds that you have laid out in the MUTCD for using a pedestrian hybrid beacon are warrants or are they guidelines? There's a lot of confusion, I think, out there about whether you have to meet certain warrants in order to use a pedestrian hybrid beacon. And I wonder if that's something you could help break down for us.
Yeah, these are guidelines. It's a should condition. So these are guidelines, but again, with an engineering study that shows otherwise, then it's not like a may condition where it's not truly an option, but with enough documentation and engineering judgment, then these are not held in the same regard as signal warrants.
Yeah.
So these are just guidelines.
Okay, and thanks for clearing that up, because I do think that there's there has been some confusion out there about that. So the question that came in about the 20 pedestrians per hour count, is that a firm number as the way you'd see something for like a traffic signal warrant? And they're not exactly the same. It doesn't sound like in the guidance that are laid out there.
Right.
Great. Well, thank you. That's the main one I wanted to go ahead and hit. We're gonna move into the rest of the presentations. That one came up a few times during yours, so I just wanted to get that answered. But I will say before we move on completely, this figure here and some of the other information that's on the MUTCD website, I did send out a link to Part 4 and some of this information. It's worth digging through some of that, as is the step guide and some of the information on the basics of the pedestrian hybrid beacon, how it works, what it's used for. That's good to have in your back pocket in case these questions come up. What we're going to do now is shift over. We're going to hear from two cities that are using these and have some really sort of good on the ground experience, and then bring it all back together for more discussion at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and move right into Joel Meyer's presentation. So Joel, if you keep an eye on your screen, you should see the screen come to you, and we can hear what's going on in Austin, Texas. Okay, great. You're all set.
All right. Thanks a lot, Dan. And thanks, Dwayne, for presenting all that. It's really helpful. Yeah, so I am the pedestrian coordinator for City of Austin. I've been with the city a little less than 2 years now. So I'm actually going to have a colleague of mine, Renee, join us for the Q&A to answer some of the more technical things if those come up. But I'm happy to be here and share some of our experience. So let's see, I'm trying to get to this second slide. So if you've been to Austin, this is kind of the scene that we like to portray. You know, we have a pretty walkable urban core. We've made a lot of progress in the last decade or so, really making a walkable city kind of in the city center. But like a lot of cities, the further you get away from downtown, it starts to look more like this. So this is just about a half mile away from downtown. Start to get, wider streets, longer distances between crossings, things like that. This is the same street, Congress, about 2 miles away from downtown. And so you can really see the problems that creates for pedestrians, especially when you start to get, more intense land uses on streets that were once designed as highways. Really is just not an environment that is really conducive to safe pedestrian activity. So the PHB is really one of our best tools for addressing situations like this. So I'll kind of talk about how we think of PHBs in our larger pedestrian safety strategy. Just to give a little quick plug to some of the work we've been doing on our pedestrian safety action plan, which was just released. We did a pretty detailed crash analysis of crashes in Austin for the last 5 or 6 years. And some of these stats just kind of illustrate how PHBs can help out with these situations. So we found that around a third of our serious injury and fatality and fatal crashes can be categorized as crossing roadway vehicle not turning. So if you're familiar with the PVCAT crash typing software, it kind of categorizes different crash types. This can be both at stop controlled or unsignalized locations. So it's a big chunk of our pedestrian crashes. We also found that around 38% of our pedestrian crashes occur mid-block, but 74% of our fatalities occur mid-block. So you can really tell the severity really increases away from the intersection. And again, the mid-block crashes were twice as likely to result in serious injury or fatality as the intersection crashes. We also found that the further you get away from a signalized crossing, the more severe the crash is. So especially after you get over a half mile away from a signalized intersection, there really is a big jump in the likelihood that that crash will result in a serious injury or fatality. And we found that the wider the street, the total street width, the more likely that crash is to result in a serious injury or fatality. So if you're interested in these kind of statistics, we have a whole chapter on that in our pedestrian safety action plan. And so again, to address some of those street design things that we're dealing with, the PHB is really a good tool for us. So this is the first one we installed back in 2009. As of today, we have 64 installed. And this graph kind of shows our progress over the last decade. We rely on a combination of operational funding, grants, bond dollars, things like that. And so we've kind of been pretty steady over the last decade. As you can see on the far right, for a number of reasons, we're about to seriously ramp up the number of PHBs we have installed in the city. The voters of Austin passed a $720 million mobility bond in 2016, and we've identified funding for another 50 plus PHBs that'll be constructed in the next couple of years. So we're really keeping an eye on how these are working and how we can make sure people are complying with the PHBs as we roll more of them out. I'll talk a little bit about the user behavior that we've seen. Overall, I think people in Austin really understand how to use PHBs. They've really taken an interest in them. We get a lot of requests. And overall, we've seen pretty good compliance. The word pedestrian hybrid beacon has kind of entered the vocabulary of our citizens and our elected officials. So, that's kind of a good sign that they're really taking off. This is a picture of our most used PHB, kind of in a very high activity location near transit and a grocery store. It's also in sort of a lower income area of Austin where people may be more dependent on walking or transit. And so this one last Thursday was activated 659 times. A lot of our PHBs have data that we can pull on the number of actuations. So we keep track of that as well. This study was done by Federal Highway Administration and the Texas Transportation Institute a couple years ago, looking at road user behavior at PHBs. They actually looked at 20 locations in Tucson and Austin, so it gave us a really good data set to look at in terms of what's happening in our area. I think Dwayne may have mentioned this, but they found that 96% of drivers yielded to pedestrians, and that's probably undercounting a little bit. Interestingly, they also found that around 5% of the time there was a driver that didn't go after the flashing red came on. So I think that number's probably improved as more people have gotten used to how PHBs work. I think early on, it was a little different than what people have seen in the past. So there may be some education and just kind of experience that has led to better outcomes over time. Other things that we do operationally, this was brought up by Dwayne, but typically MUTCD recommends installing the PHB 100 feet away from cross streets and driveways. A lot of times that's difficult to avoid just because those are where the desire lines are, and especially in really urban land uses, there's a lot of driveways and things like that. But one thing we have seen is that when the flashing red and the steady red comes on, drivers on the side streets will kind of use that as their opportunity to make a turn, which sounds kind of problematic, but I think really what we've seen is it's not as big of an issue. I think people take those turns pretty slowly. They kind of know that they're kind of skirting the law a little bit, but we haven't really seen too big of a problem with that. And again, it's a lot of times the PHB placement makes the most sense at those intersections. In terms of the signage and other equipment, so we install audible pedestrian signals with all of our PHBs. just to make sure that people with disabilities can make sure that they're using the facility and have access to it. We also use this sign, which is a little different than what Dwayne laid out, but it's something that has worked for us. And again, I think people are generally understanding how to use the PHBs. We also occasionally we will synchronize the PHBs with adjacent signals. So especially when there's high volumes, we try to, sorry, I jumped ahead. We try to synchronize the PHBs. I kind of learned about that by accident because I was out one day using one of the PHBs and it didn't activate for around 30 seconds. And I thought it was broken at first, but then I kind of called our signals people and they said that they've kind of been experimenting with different synchronization schemes. So I think that's kind of on a case-by-case basis at this point, but something to consider. We also have been supplementing our PHB efforts with some education. I won't make you watch this YouTube video, but if you want to view it, you can follow that link. Just kind of showing both drivers and pedestrians how to use the PHB. In terms of prioritization, we get a lot of citizen requests. I think we get over 100 per year for PHBs and signalized intersections. I'm sorry, my presentation's a little slow right now. Trying to go to the next slide, just a second. Yeah, so we get around 100 requests per year. Really, I think early on, we didn't have a lot of guidance and guidelines for how and where and when we want to install PHBs. So we wanted to develop a more transparent process for how we prioritize PHBs. Sorry, my presentation is freezing up right now, but I will just continue. So, we look at a number of different factors when we're taking requests. We kind of do a baseline assessment early on, look at pedestrian volumes. Is it within 300 feet of a signalized crossing? Looking at pedestrian crash history, things like that. And then once per year, we take all of those requests and we take the top 10 scoring PHBs and we kind of forward them on for further detailed study. And that's really looking at those things that Dwayne mentioned in the MUTCD. So things based on different crossing distances and pedestrian volumes and vehicle volumes, there are certain criteria that we're looking to be met before we would install the PHB. We also leave room for engineering judgment. So, especially taking into account things like latent demand, a lot of times the pedestrian volumes may not be very high in areas where people don't feel safe to walk. But if we were to install a PHB, perhaps those volumes would increase. So that's one of the ways we, account for latent demand. If you'll just give me 1 second, I'm going to try to get this presentation working again.
Hey, Joel, this is Dan. If you like, I can try to broadcast your slides from my end if you think
if you could do that, that'd be great. I'm sorry that Peter's kind of freezing up on me.
That's no problem. Let me try that real quick. Just 1 second. Okay, let me see if this works. Let me know if you see your slides on my end now.
I do, yeah.
Okay, great. Just let me know when to move forward.
Okay, if you could go a couple slides forward. Next one. Okay, so yeah, that's good. So yeah, we keep track of all our citizen requests. We have sort of a really good open data portal where people can check the status of where their PHB is, whether it's under evaluation or that more detailed study, and we keep those up there until we can find funding or they fall off the list. You can go to the next slide. So these are that initial scoring that we do. So this is actually done for every request that we get, and we rank them all against each other and then recommend the top 10 for further study. Go ahead. Again, there's the curve, separate curves for under and over 35 miles an hour, and this is in the Texas MUTCD, but it's I think it's the same as the national guidelines.
Question while we're here, Joel, a few people are asking about your latent demand measure or how you kind of incorporate that. Could you talk a little bit about what goes into that?
Yeah, so as you can see here on the curve, it takes into account pedestrians per hour, so that's observed volumes. But we're trying to make a more walkable city where we believe that if you build it, they will come. So we look at pedestrian generators, adjacent to the location. We look at, does it provide a safe route to school? Are there pedestrian generators where maybe there's we have a lot of schools for mobility impaired people here in Austin, so those are the types of things we look at for latent demand.
Great.
Go ahead. So like I said, PHBs are just one part of our larger pedestrian safety strategy. So they are really great for those long crossing distances, high volume type of streets. But we also realize that there is a lot of other tools in the toolbox. And go to the next slide. I think this got cut off, but these are just some of the examples of types of things we're looking to do more low cost of. There you go. So refuge islands, RRFBs, really low cost things with in-street signage. On the bottom right, that's an example out of Michigan, the gateway treatment people may be familiar with that has seen really good compliance. So those are the types of things we're really looking at system-wide, so we don't have to spend so much money on these pretty expensive facilities. Go to the next one. So just to illustrate that point, this is an actual example from Austin. This is a 65-foot street, 45-mile-an-hour speed limit with 1,800 vehicles per hour. And so under the PHB guidelines that we use, it would recommend a PHB in this situation, which right now is costing us upwards of $100,000, probably more right now. If you go to the next slide, you can see the same cross section. If we were to actually just implement a refuge island in the middle, take the same assumptions in terms of crossing distance and speed limit and vehicles per hour, we could actually, the guidelines would say that something like an RRFB or some type of other active or enhanced treatment would have just as big of a safety benefit for that street. So you can see that treatment would cost around $10,000 to $30,000. So almost an order of magnitude lower, and so we can do a lot more of those in a lot of other situations. So we're here in Austin. We're developing internal guidelines for when we use these types of treatments versus the PHB, the STEP guidelines and the everyday counts, things that Dan mentioned earlier are really helping with that. And so we're really excited to kind of steer away from the PHB when we don't have to use it and use other types of treatments. I think one thing we want to keep an eye on, because we've installed so many PHBs that people are really used to using those, we want to make sure that they also understand how to use these other types of treatments correctly. So there'll probably be a coordinated education enforcement campaign as we do more lower cost treatments. And one thing we're really concerned about are kind of the multiple threat crashes where one person yields and the other driver doesn't. So I'd be really interested to hear what other cities are doing to avoid those types of crashes, and maybe that's another webinar in the future. If you go to the next slide. So another way that we're really using PHBs as part of our larger pedestrian safety strategy is to support transit. So as you can see in this figure, this is another example in Austin. You know, there's pretty heavily used bus stops just because of where the pedestrian generators are. There's some big apartment complexes right near those transit stops. It's 65 feet to cross right there. But if we were to ask people to go out of their way to the nearest signalized intersection, it'd be a 1,500-foot walk. So, you know, some people will make that decision to do that. A lot of people won't, especially when it's 100 degrees out here in the summer. I think a lot of people are just going to choose to cross mid-block. So the PHB is a really great tool to help address that type of situation. Next slide. Just to show how we've started to work with our transit agency more on something like that. We just recently were selected for a $1.5 million grant from our MPO to install PHBs at locations that specifically support access to transit. So our transit provider is doing a complete overhaul of the bus service right now to do a more high frequency network. So with that, they're asking people to walk a little further. So we wanted to make sure that we were, you know, supporting that that network with better pedestrian access. So this is showing areas where we will be installing PHBs to support that transit access. It's actually overlaid with median household income. We found that our highest crash pedestrian tracks are located in areas where people are more dependent on transit. So we specifically wanted to improve safety in those areas where people are having to walk or ride the bus to get to work. So we're really excited about that. We're using a lot of the data we got out of our pedestrian safety action plan to help make the case for that, and really excited to get started on that. Next slide. So that's all I got. I apologize for the technical difficulties. That's my contact information. And again, on the Q&A, Renee may be chiming in for some of the things I can't answer, but thanks a lot for having me.
Great. Thanks so much, Joel. Appreciate it. We've got some questions rolling in. I'd like to go ahead and continue with the presentations first, and then we'll bring it all back together for Q&A. So Ryan, you'll be up next, and let me know when you put your screen across, and I'll let you know when I see it.
All right.
All right, you're all set.
Awesome. Thank you for having me, Joel. That was a great presentation. Our experience is a little different just because we're kind of new to the game for PHBs, so I think it'll be good to have both ends of the spectrum. It sounds like Austin, you guys have almost 70 of these. But yeah, so pedestrian hydrant beacons, I think the first thing that I want to kind of talk about is the Ohio law. We're a yield state, so for us, this is a great treatment for ped safety because a lot of our other treatments essentially only require cars to yield. Our state law says that a driver shall yield the right-of-way to a pedestrian crossing the roadway. So a pedestrian hydrant beacon is one of our only active devices that we have out there, really that and traffic signals that we can use to actually stop traffic for those pedestrians. So that's a great tool when you're talking about mid-block crossings when maybe people aren't expecting someone to be crossing the roadway. Let's see. And the other nice part here for PHBs, which I think we'll get into a little bit later, is since we are a yield state, if we want to put up any kind of mid-block crossing with an accessible pedestrian treatment, we don't really like to do that with a device like an RFB or an LED sign that only requires traffic to yield. So I'll give you a quick timeline of the City of Columbus's experience. So 2016, we've had our first 4 of these were installed, and quick disclaimer here, I've only been here about the same amount of time Joel was at Austin, about 2 years, a little under 2 years. So these were installed when I first came here. So I can't talk about, you know, the past history, but I can talk about our experience with them and kind of where we're going in the future. But yeah, so we have 4 of these installed. We have 1 on a 2-lane road, and the other 3 are on 4 greater lane roads. We have 1 in construction right now for 2018, and that is kind of in conjunction with, we have a large signal removal effort throughout the City of Columbus that's piggybacking off of some congestion mitigation air quality funds that we have, putting fiber to all of our traffic signals, including PHBs, throughout the City of Columbus. So we're having to remove some signals but we have to find other treatments or, even find go past close to those signals where we can allow pedestrians to safely cross. And then we have 2 more planned for 2021. So all together right now at the end of the summer, we're only gonna have 5. But this has been a great treatment, and we're kind of trying to proliferate these throughout the city, as we'll get into a little bit later, because of the education with these. So as you can see, I kind of have a map up here. The green are where our 4 PHBs are currently installed. Like Joel said, he had a great slide on how once you get outside the urban area, when you have these large multi-lane section of roadways, how do you treat mid-block crossings? And that's pretty much exactly what we're seeing here too. The city of Columbus, our mid-block's kind of dead in the center. And a lot of these are kind of when you're getting outside, but you have these large arterials. How do you get pedestrians across safely? Especially, like I said, we're a yield state. And the PHB for us has been a great treatment. And we have, you can see the purple are the 3 that we have planned. And I'll talk a little bit about those, but one of the 2 we have planned are, since this has been a success so far here, we have a large 5-mile section of corridor that we just applied for some funds for. And 2 of those treatments, most of them are going to be overhead RFBs or going to be PHBs, because it's in conjunction with a bus rapid transit service that our local transit agency just installed. So I think what I want to talk about is a little bit more about how do we get to the PHB itself. We don't just jump in and kind of point to, hey, we're going to put a PHB here and the kind of you get a PHB and you get a PHB. What we do is we have some targeted ways that we go through all of our crosswalk requests. That's kind of what I want to talk about here is we have a kind of 6-step process on how we end up with a PHB, or we'll even say, or hitting the pedestrian signal warrants. So the first step is we have to have the public outreach. And the way that we do that is kind of like Austin had their mapping function. We have a 311 call center. So you can either call in or do an online request, and you can request a new crosswalk. So just for, I think we had 70 requests for new crosswalks last year. And typically when people put that in, PHBs aren't as ubiquitous here in the city of Columbus as they are in Austin. So people don't know what to ask for. They just know, hey, when I cross here, it makes me feel uncomfortable. So they put a request in for a new crosswalk. So what we do with each one of these requests is we will gather some safety data. The biggest being crash data. If we're having a crash problem, this may really quickly rise to the top of the pile. We may kind of expedite it. Also, if we have some kind of sight distance constraints, that really kind of tells us whether or not we needed to kind of skip some of these next steps in the process. Like I said, especially with crash data, which we are doing with, like I said, that 5-mile corridor is a high crash data location that, this is where one of the treatments we're using to address those. But anyway, so we go through the safety data. We have a kind of preliminary filter, and what this allows us to do is it's a risk generator score. So we look at things like what's the crosswalk spacing, how far to the nearest signal, are there any pedestrian generators like a mall or a park, what's the speed limit, what are the number of travel lanes. So depending where that falls, if it's a low risk and there's no pedestrian generation, we're kind of not going to go to the next step where we kind of start gathering and going through the data just for interest of time and being able to best utilize staff resources. So what we do is we'll go to the next step, which is data collection. If this hits our risk generator filter, like I said, which is the high level filter. And with data collection, that's typically just traffic and pedestrian counts. And we do this a lot of times through video cameras and really mainly MyoVision, because we can get counts and watch the video that way. Sometimes we'll put some pneumatic tubes down to count as well. But that's the data that we'll gather. And then we kind of step into the evaluation treatment. So with the evaluation treatment, what we do is we're kind of using the NCHRP 562 report as our basis, which is the improving pedestrian safety at unsignalized crossings. There have been some more, there's been a lot of guidance out recently. We just kind of sat down and talked about it if we want to tweak our process. But what we ended up doing was we made a spreadsheet where we input all this data kind of to make the sausage, and then what it does is it kind of spits out the NCHRP report recommendations for whether it's going to be just a, what kind of level do we need to look here? Do we need to look at an active enhanced crossing? Do we need to look at a signalized crossing? Or is it something simple as, hey, this is just going to be an unmarked crosswalk? But what we do is, as part of that, we look at the traffic counts that we pulled from step 4, which is the number of lanes, PEDs within, is it within a school zone? Is it on a safe route to school? Are there adequate sidewalks? Is there a median, or, is there a possibility of adding a median? And then we look at the PED delay. And like I said, this kind of makes the sausage, and this tells us, this doesn't preclude any kind of or exclude any kind of engineering judgment, but it kind of tells us where we fall and gives us a good impetus where to go from there. So then the last step is, if this is saying this is, a higher level treatment, a PHB or a pedestrian signal warrant. I think Dwayne kind of talked about both of those. Maybe not as much the signal warrant, but we make sure we meet the 4F2 criteria in Chapter 4 of which for us is Ohio Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, just to make sure we're kind of following the letter of the law there. And then also, it's much easier, like Dwayne said, to meet the PHB warrant than it is to meet the pedestrian signal warrant 4, which I think even if you have a lot of traffic is like 133, somewhere around there, is a minimum number of pedestrians. We only have very few signals that actually that's the only warrant that they meet. Some by our hockey arena that aren't meeting by traffic. So really, like I said, the PHB and that 4F2 is a great tool that we use to kind of go through. So I'm going to quickly step through what our how we ramp up our treatments. The first one we have is really level 0, be an unmarked crosswalk with just curb ramps, and then for a maybe kind of a lower pedestrian generator here, we'll put in some transverse lines. Then we step up to the next step here, which is we'll put in the piano keys or the ladders across those and make sure that we have the signs up, the W11-2s. And then the next level is, hey, if we can fit a refuge island or put a curb extension by an intersection or bump out, something to create a multi-stage crossing and or shorten the length of crossing or shorten the length that a ped has to cross. That's kind of our next step. And then what we do is we'll start looking at overhead signs, flashing beacons, LED line signs, and then the RFBs, which Dwayne said have been on again, off again. But for us, that's been a great tool here as well. And here, for the level 4, I just have a couple different pictures of kind of the same, if this meets a level 4 for us, this is the kind of stuff we put in. So the first one was just an overhead illuminated sign. This one is a sign with just an overhead beacon. And then here are some pedestal mounted RFBs for a level 4. But really what we want to talk about today, and that's why you guys invited me here, is, hey, we start getting into these ones where we have some higher PED generation, we have higher traffic conflicts. What do we do to help people safely get across the street? So here's a picture of one of our 4, the Morris Road location. And this is kind of where we go for our, for our safest, most compliant pedestrian crossing device, because this is a stop condition. So, once we go through there, we'll install the RFB through some means or method, or sorry, the PHB by getting some kind of funding, whether it's safety funding through the state, going through the local agency. We're kind of exploring these different routes since we're kind of new to the game. And I know with Austin, they have great compliance. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but I think that the proliferation of these devices actually will eventually end up making them better devices, because people will, they'll be expecting them and they'll know what they are, and they'll have them on their everyday commute to work or to school. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about one of the issues that we have had with the PHBs, and I know that Joel had touched on this with coordination with adjacent signals. Here is one of our pedestrian hybrid beacons we put in. This is just a 2-lane road. It's just north of one of our east-west interstates. And what the problem we had with this one is, you can see here, about 500 feet from the 2 adjacent signals. So we put this in and we did not coordinate it to start off with. We got a bunch of complaints that, the traffic's backing up. Typically it's southbound here because that's where everybody's going in the PM peak to get to the interstate through the adjacent signal. And this roadway kind of splits our Ohio Dominican University campus here from the parking lot and parking on the west side in the bookstore to the main campus on the east side. So what we did is we did some observations And what we found was we tried to coordinate this, but it actually made it worse because college kids apparently just hit the button and expect to get a walking man. So, or sometimes they will not hit the button and they will just kind of cross the street. So since we've set this one free and it's not running coordinated, it hasn't really been a huge issue. But what we've done, and I'm going to kind of talk about this in a little bit, is this has kind of highlighted our need for education with these. And that's where I want to talk about with, since we are new to the game here, I think other communities could benefit from our experience, which really for us, the biggest issue has been education. I'll give you a quick anecdote for this signal. So our signal operations engineer was out there observing this PHB, and he noticed 2 Columbus police officers waiting for it. So a student hit the button and crossed, and then the signal was going into the wigwag mode. And the crossing was clear, and the first police officer went through, and the second police officer waited until the wigwag completed, even though the crossing was clear to go. So that kind of gave us a kick in the pants that said, hey, we have to kind of do some more public outreach. We need to really target these areas as well as law enforcement to get them up to speed with how these operate and, what you're supposed to do when you're both using a PHB as a driver and as a pedestrian. So what we did was we did our education campaign after the fact, and I think this will kind of be a lessons learned for other communities. I would probably front load the education campaign. So what we did was we did a press release after these were installed. We did an email blast typically to that unit, or mainly to that university where we installed it, kind of telling them how to use it. We put up a PHB website and a fact sheet. The fact sheet actually we put out at each one of our pedestrian hybrid beacons in kind of those real estate boxes, so people could take those and learn a little bit more on how PHB operates. And then the bottom left sign, we actually made that as a chloroplast sign and zip tied it to our PHB, so people could go there and figure out what it's all about and how it operates. And then the bottom right is, some of our news stations did finally pick up our press release and do some stories, which helped us out a lot. So, here's some, the left is our website that we put together, that if you go back to this link, if you go to that bit link, it'll dump you to the website on the left, which kind of talks about the PHBs. And on the right, we have, this is part of our pamphlet, which just shows how PHB operates. And then the bottom right of this, we piggybacked off of our Ohio Department of Transportation. They made a short video for the first PHB that was installed in Ohio, how it operated. So we thought that'd be a great place for people to be able to go to that website and kind of watch that and figure out how it works. So like I said, the lessons learned, really what I want to step back to is the coordination thing. We actually are not coordinating any of these right now because we found the compliance has been all but one so low when we try to coordinate these. The pedestrians hit the button and they really think that they should cross. Unless we have a 7-lane section that's high speed, people will wait for that one. But some of these other ones where it's not as wide of a cross section, people hit the button and just go across. So we really haven't seen many operational deficiencies, maybe because the Ohio Dominican example I just showed was the only signal that is relatively close in proximity, that's under like 1,500 feet for the nearest signal. But we really, we've realized that compliance is much better from the pedestrian side if we run these free, and we haven't seen much operational adverse impacts to that. So that's kind of one of our lessons learned. The other one was when we first installed these, we had the stop on red signs with you can see here the old signs. And the problem with that was nobody knew that they could, because these were new, at the end of 2016, nobody knew that when, hey, I'm driving up to these, there's nobody in the crosswalk and the beacon is wigwagging, that I can actually proceed on these when there's nobody there. So FHWA came out with guidance, I think in March of 17, for these new signs, the R23As, which Dwayne talked about. And so we've oversized these and placed these on all 4 of our PHBs. And actually the 5th one is going to have one on it too that's going operational here this summer. So here is also, like I said, this is the kind college campus one, where we changed out the signs. It's this 2-lane road that splits the college campus. There are very high pedestrian volumes, but we've seen also low use of the PHB in terms of pedestrians not realizing they have to push the button and just crossing. I think the biggest reason for this is they're college students and they just want to get to their car and go home, but also this is a 2-lane road. Like I said, if this would have been like a 4 or 5-lane section road, I think our compliance would have been a little bit higher, but we really targeted this one for education. Through email, working with the school and our communications department so they can send out emails, give out pamphlets out here. So this is one we've really targeted, and I think it's gotten a little bit better, but still, college kids, I guess, do what they want. And then also the lessons learned, here is our 7-lane section, high speed. I know Joel talked a little bit about, hey, is there any way to, these are expensive. These are about $150,000 a pop to install PHB, but it's much cheaper than doing a pedestrian grade separation. However, this Morris Road location, so it's a 7-lane section, 3 lanes each direction with bike lanes against the curb. And we have a 2-way left turn lane that runs down the middle, which for this multi-stage crossing, you can see we installed a pedestrian refuge island. And the problem with this was since I believe it's November or December, we've had our center pedestals hit 3 times. And, even though it's marked as 45, I'm sure that the free flow 85th percentile speed is much higher. And a lot of these times these are hit at night. So what we've done is we've really we started to delineate this thing by putting up signs or putting up quick curb in front of it. We're painting it yellow, and we're putting up a special reflective curb to really delineate this infrastructure. Because we don't want to have to be out there changing our push buttons, but if our push buttons are getting hit, what does that say for pedestrian safety? So we're really trying to enhance that center refuge island the best way that we can. So I guess my lesson learned here would be if you're going to be putting in a refuge island, get across a 6-7 lane arterial that's high speed, I would really enhance that ped refuge island. Unless you want to have your maintenance crews out there changing stuff all the time or have low compliance because people are scared to cross the street. So the last lesson learned that we have is education and public outreach. So like I said, we waited until after construction to really do our public outreach on these, which for us was a big lesson learned. We got with City of Columbus Police Department. We have regular meetings with them, and what they wanted from us is us to create a video that shows them that they can kind of shoot out to all their precincts for when they have their meetings to show how these operate and how what the enforcement end of these are going to be, because really our next step is we're going to have to get enforcement out there to really make sure that these are complied with mainly by drivers, so pedestrians feel safe crossing the street. So the biggest lesson learned for us, and I think other communities can take this away, is this is new infrastructure. This is this is something that people may not be used to. So don't wait until after construction. Get funding secured for a public outreach campaign, get your stuff in order, starting letting the community know that this is coming. For us, this has been a huge lesson learned. Like I said, we have a 5-mile long project that we're about to be putting in a bunch of overhead RFBs and 2 pedestrian hybrid beacons in conjunction with bus rapid transit. And also it's because of our regional planning organization kind of gave us some pedestrian crash data and overlaid it, and it's a high crash location for mid-block crossings. So what we're doing here is we're front loading this thing with a bunch of money for a public outreach campaign, because that has been our lesson learned. If people don't know, if these aren't ubiquitous like they are in Austin, people don't know how to use them, you're not going to get great compliance. So that's kind of been our biggest lesson here, and we've kind of taken that to heart, and we're going to be taking that forward here from all of our pedestrian projects going forward. So that is the last slide that I have. I would like to thank you, Dan, for having me, and I think we're probably going to move back to your end here.
Yep, I'm going to take the screen back from you all, and let me just get my slides back up and running. I've got contact information for our panelists up on the screen. If we don't get to your questions, I hope that you'll be able to reach out to them directly to get those answered. But let's go ahead and get right into it. Lots of different questions in all different areas. So I wanna touch on a little bit of everything. I want to ask first, Dwayne, if you can weigh in on this one. A lot of questions right at the beginning. When you were covering the PHB and the wigwag, the red wigwag that comes up about a little bit of the way through the signal operation, there are a lot of questions about how that pattern might be similar to what you typically see at a railroad crossing, where a flashing system of lights can require drivers to stop maybe as the train is approaching a crossing. I'm probably butchering that because I'm not as familiar with rail crossings, but can you talk about the similarities between those two patterns and maybe whether or not there's been consideration of that pattern maybe sending a different message to drivers depending on whether it's a PHB versus a rail crossing?
Yeah, that is I guess a known issue that was considered. I know the National Committee, I think, made known early on some concerns they had, but then I think they kind of went back and forth on the issue as well. But I think, obviously there is potential for confusion, but I think when it was added to the MUTCD and weighing all the comments and the different possibilities, it was decided to go ahead and use this. And so that's basically the situation right now. But it is understood that is a potential concern because normally the wigwag red you would see that at the railroad, and obviously you're not going to encourage people to stop and then proceed at a railroad signal. But this is a little different situation. These are usually in urban areas that are, where there's a lot more traffic and lit areas and things. So it's potential, but it was decided to go ahead with that flash pattern.
Okay, very good. And Joel and Ryan, is that an issue that's come up in your application of these treatments? Has there been concern in your departments about maybe the first few that there was that similarity, or is not really a concern?
I haven't heard that get brought up, but it's certainly understandable if there was some confusion early on. But I think generally speaking, we've seen really good kind of understanding of how to use it.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, that issue was discussed at the last National Committee meeting, and so I think if people do have concerns with that, there will be an opportunity in the next version of the MUTCD when we put out the rulemaking and open that up for public comments. That would be a good time to voice any concerns and issues.
Yeah. And Ryan, did you have something there on that?
Yeah, actually, no public has complained about this. It's actually only been our internal engineers saying it's like a wigwag like the railroad, but nothing from the public. So.
Okay. Yep. So some questions about cost. I know cost typically does come up, and these are not, I think if you think about the range of treatments that are laid out in STEP, at least, the PHB is probably not on the cheaper end of the spectrum. You both mentioned that it's one of the more expensive treatments. I think we heard range of like $100,000 to $150,000 ballpark for a cost of a PHB installation. I just want to confirm, Joel and Ryan, is that about what you use as your ballpark measure?
Yeah, I think probably closer to 150 right now.
Okay. Cool.
Okay.
And a lot of questions came up about detection, and I think mostly, Brian, during your presentation, people were asking because they heard what you were saying about the decision of whether or not the pedestrians will use the push button. And I think in college campuses that may be true. There may be cases where if people are arriving at a trail crossing and they're riding a bike or they're running or something like that, they maybe are going to look for their own gap even after pushing the button. Maybe they don't push the button at all. So I'm curious about, for both of your cities, whether you're experimenting or thinking about using any kind of a passive detection or any other way for the signal, for the person to be entered into the signal without them necessarily needing to push the button. Any thought about that?
We haven't looked into that, to my knowledge. I think there are times when people don't actuate it, either because they don't know how to use it or they can just, there's a big enough gap in the traffic where they can just cross. But I don't believe we've been looking at passive detection.
Okay. Okay.
We have not been looking here in Columbus at passive detection. We tried it a couple of years ago at other signals and it didn't work out real well. So yeah, we're not really pursuing it anymore.
Okay, great. Some questions about the education component of your programs. You both touched on the need to do a little bit of education and outreach around these treatments, so a variety of different audiences. And I wanted to ask Joel, since you've got so many treatments now in place, have you seen the need to do a lot of education kind of go down over time since they're more prevalent? Do people seem to know what they are and what they're used for since there's so many of them around now that you've got so many?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the good behavior we've seen is probably more a result of just having more out there. But that said, we do want to make sure that we are always, continuing with the education component, just because with so many new people moving here, things like that, we definitely want to stay on top of that. Especially as we're about to double the number we have, we want to make sure that in parts of the city where these may not be as ubiquitous that we're making sure we get that message out there. And then also occasionally doing enforcement. We have, through our Vision Zero program, a relationship with Austin Police Department where we can kind of help identify locations where we're seeing problems with compliance. And so, if we start to see people lapse in their behavior, I think that's another tool we have.
Okay, good. Same question, or this a question for both of you again. This is a little different topic. We've heard some discussion about using a pedestrian hybrid beacon as opposed to a full traffic signal, and I'm curious to know if there have been any locations that you've looked at to consider a pedestrian hybrid beacon and ended up going with a full signal instead. And what are the sort of things that might tip you in the direction of just going for full signalization rather than a PHB? Has that been a situation you've come across?
I may defer to Renee if she wants to chime in on this one, but I think there probably have been situations like that, and it's probably dependent on the vehicle volumes that would tip that. That's my guess.
Yes, absolutely. We do have a location we study for a PHB, and we're now actually installing a traffic signal. So definitely cross-street traffic can be a large contributor to that decision. But whenever we study a location for a signal or a PHB, sometimes you go in studying one and you determine that really the other device is more appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask about locations where we're focusing. A lot of the step guidance focuses on pedestrian safety, obviously, but the bicyclists, especially at trail crossings, are users of PHBs in some locations. And I forgot if you covered this or not, but are any of your locations ones where you see a fair number of bicyclists using the crossing as well as pedestrians? Does that change your decision making in terms of whether to use a PHB versus another treatment? Or are you finding the PHB to be a good location for crossings, no matter a good selection for crossings, no matter whether they're bicyclists or pedestrians using it?
Austin, I have to answer this. We don't have any here in Columbus trail crossings.
Okay.
I'm sure, I can't think off the top of my head where we've specifically installed a PHB as a trail crossing, but I'm sure we have one. But yeah, I mean, I think that's another tool that is part of the bicycle safety toolbox. I can't speak as much to some of the pros and cons of that for bikes, but I think it's certainly something to consider.
Great. Dwayne, going back to you for a moment on the selection, kind of using those various curves for above 35 and below 35, and kind of collecting that data on pedestrian crossings and vehicles per hour. There were some questions that came across about recommended ways in which agencies should go about collecting that data. For example, someone asked, when you're looking at your vehicle and pedestrian per hour counts to find out where you land on those charts, is it recommended to select the vehicle peak period and then use the pedestrian counts from that same hour, or to select the peak hour for the pedestrian and use the vehicle counts from that same hour? What's the good rule of thumb for collecting that type of information to find out where you fall on that curve?
Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, I think what you're looking for is that the pedestrian count and the vehicle count would be for the same hour.
Right.
Because what you're really doing is using the curves to assess the predicted gaps and the ease and concern of a pedestrian trying to cross a busy traffic stream based on the distance and gaps. So I think you're looking at the same hour for that comparison, similar to how you would apply the signal warrants.
Okay.
If that was the question.
Yeah, it was, and it sounds like from most of the comments we received, in the comment pod, a lot of people are finding that hour when they have the most pedestrian crossings and getting that count and then using that same hour for their vehicle counts. And I guess Joel and Ryan, is that similar to the process you all use to get those different numbers?
Yeah, we use peak as well for both pedestrians and vehicles. One thing I'll add is that we were talking about the idea of latent demand. We've talked to a couple other cities that for exercises like this, rather than observing pedestrian counts, they actually set a goal. So based on land uses or other generators, what is the pedestrian activity that we would expect if we had good infrastructure? So I think that's another way to look at it, kind of allowing some room for engineering judgment.
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
Dan, if I could back up just for a second to
Sure.
the comments I made about the guidelines and kind of comparing this to the signal warrants. I want to make sure I didn't send the message that you shouldn't, that you should just arbitrarily pick. It really is engineering judgment and study. And I really like what our other presenters said kind of about the step process of evaluating the situation. Obviously, you're not going to go to this right out of the bat as the first thing you do. I really like the idea of kind of having a process to go through less expensive and less interruptive type treatments, and then working your way up and reserving these for the locations that meet the guidance in that chart, but also based on the cost and everything else you have to consider. Again, this is not really the first thing out of the bag you're going to use. You can violate a should, but obviously that should be rare. You don't want to just arbitrarily do that. I just want to make sure I was clear on that.
No, thanks for clarifying that, and I think that it illustrates the point. I think an important point that this is a bit of a there's wiggle room in here. You are using your judgment and all the various factors at a location. I mean, Joel and Ryan both showed some locations that have very unique characteristics, and each location is not going to be like another. The college campus is probably not the same as the commercial corridor with 6 or 7 lanes. And I think being able to tailor the solution to that condition is really important. And I don't want to put words in your mouths, but I got the impression from both the presentations from Austin and Columbus that the PHB is a valuable part of your toolbox, but you are trying to maybe steer toward some other types of treatments, maybe lower cost, but also instead of just putting in a PHB, it sounds like you're also trying to do things like help manage volumes and speeds and bring those down, maybe lower the crossing distances to really further protect pedestrians. Because I think that I'm getting the sense from both of your presentations that the PHB may be the last sort of resort treatment. If you can do other things, it seems like you want to do that. So I'm curious to know from your perspectives, I guess, if you could speculate, like, is it managing sort of the volumes, bringing the volumes down, traffic volumes down, or is it speed management that's really maybe more of a core focus for your overall networks and improving safety citywide, more so than finding those spots where you should install PHBs? Joel or Ryan, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. The PHB is definitely one tool in our toolbox, and at least here it's sort of a victim of its own success in that it's automatically the first thing people think of when they think of a crossing, crossing treatment. So we're trying to get away from that, just mainly due to lack of resources, and we can do a lot more things citywide. I think, yeah, speed management is a huge part of it. If we can even lower speeds a little bit, that really opens up the types of crossing treatments we can do. So, we're looking for ways to do that. We're a little limited in Texas with what we can do. We're not allowed to use speed cameras and things like that, but there are other things we can do with speed humps and stuff like that. So yeah, I think it's really important to look at it as part of a larger strategy.
Okay. And the last question I had is actually one that's come up a few times. Joel and Ryan, you can weigh in on this maybe. Some challenges that people are facing, it sounds like, when trying to put PHBs in on state-owned roads, and maybe where there's a difference between the way that the city approaches the use of a PHB and the way a state agency might do that. And I wonder if you could share any thoughts or any recommendations of the ways that you've gone around working together with your state DOTs to come up with a good solution, maybe a PHB at a crossing. Has that been a challenge when you've got different jurisdictional ownership over a location?
That's a quick and easy answer for here in Columbus. We're a home rule state, so really we do work with our Ohio Department of Transportation. They have a whole program over there that we work hand in hand with them, but typically it's kind of up to us if it's on a city-owned road whether or not what we do with our with that. Okay, good to know. Makes things easier. And Joel, any thoughts on the state versus local, the collaboration between the two?
Yeah. I mean, we've run into that a couple times. I think early on, our DOT was a little reluctant to do PHBs in places where we would want them. But I think as we've kind of shown their success in other places around town, they've been more open to doing them as long as we can, show the warrants and get good data to back it up. And it is an issue because a lot of our major arterials, like the photos I showed earlier of Congress, are state-owned roads that were designed as highways. So I think we're making a lot of progress on that front.
Great, excellent. All right. Well, I wanted to ask as a final question, the classic question that comes up that we always get with respect to the PHB is the comparison between the PHB and the rapid flashing beacon. That always seems to be a deciding point. And now that the RRFB is kind of back on the table, we all know about the interim approval that was released, and we're incorporating that back into the STEP guidance. But I wonder, from your perspectives, and Dwayne, if you have thoughts on this as well, what do you see as some of the key deciding factors between using a rapid flashing beacon versus the pedestrian hybrid beacon? We know that the cost is very different, but I wonder what some of those other roadway factors, vehicle and speed factors you look at and really tend to tip the scales one direction or the other.
Well, I believe they're both tools in the toolbox. I think you have to just kind of weigh the compliance rate, as I said, with the RFBs are somewhat situational. I think you get really good compliance in some cases and not so as good in others. Whereas with the PHB, I think you get a much higher compliance rate, but that comes with maybe some negative issues for your traffic flow. So it really goes back to looking at the whole situation and your volumes and considering all the tools that you have in your toolbox and deciding which works best. I know a lot of states and cities have had really good success with RFBs, and since they're cheaper and maybe less of an impact on traffic, that may be something you start with and then reserve the PHBs for situations that you really need a clear stop in traffic with the red indications. Okay. But they're both available, so I'd be interested to see what our other presenters, how they compare.
Yeah, Joel, any thoughts on that? I mean, I don't know if you have more PHBs at this point than rapid flashing beacons, but what do you use to make that decision between the two?
I mean, we only have a handful of RRFBs at this point. I think probably less than 5 that I can think of. So, now that they're back on the table. I think we do want to look to use more of them when the situation is right. I'm a little worried that people here have been so conditioned to using the RF or to using PHBs and looking for a red indication that, you know, the flashing indication may not mean anything to them. So there's definitely an education component that I think we probably need to do concurrently with doing more RFBs. Yeah. You know, also I think at least, you know, for whatever reason, people here, we're not a city where people reflexively yield to pedestrians, even though it's a yield state. So, you know, you go to other cities and people, if you get anywhere close to the curb, they'll yield or stop for you. So that's not the case here. I think we have a long way to go with that, but I do want to make sure that we're doing that education as we're looking at these new treatments.
Okay, great. Thanks. And Ryan, any other thoughts on the RFB as opposed to the PHB?
Yeah, it's kind of the flip of what Austin said. We have a lot more, I think like 20 to 30 RFBs, some of them overhead throughout the city. People are kind of more used to those. So we're really reserving the PHBs because of our, you know, compliance, not compliance, but people don't really fully understand what they mean for our really kind of either high crash locations or higher volume locations that are servicing some of these, you know, bus rapid transit sites.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. That's really helpful. I know that's a decision a lot of agencies try to make a lot, is that between those two treatments. I'm sure we'll be doing some additional sessions in the future on the RFB, so stay tuned for that. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for questions today. I've got email addresses up on the slide. Hopefully you can reach out to us or to our panelists if you have any more questions we weren't able to get to today. We have posted those presentation slides that I mentioned. We will be posting the recording from today's presentation. If you want to look back at anything, it will be there for you. You're going to get an email later today in about an hour with all this information, with your certificate of attendance, with additional links for more information and resources. Keep an eye out for that. You will be greeted by a survey as you exit the webinar today to ask you, how we did today. What do you think about the webinar? What would you like to see us cover in the future? Please take some time and offer your thoughts there. We do read those and try to tailor our future sessions to stuff you're interested in. I just want to say thank you again to Dwayne, Joel, and Ryan, and Renee for joining us all. We enjoyed having them here and learning from them. And thanks to you all for joining the webinar today. Hope you have a great day, and we will see you next time. Thank you.